Harley. You don't hear no coke anymore, Harley. The only thing you hear is crack, crack, crack.
Ladies and gentlemen, what you just heard was some audio from a news report in the 1980s, an interview with a crack addict talking about how the crack epidemic was just taking over America's streets in those days. Crack, crack, crack. Everywhere you go, crack. That was the way things seemed in the America of the late 1980s. Cocaine in general was obviously the drug of choice in that era.
It's a bigger business than GM, and they don't advertise.
Move through Miami, sell it in LA. They hide it up and tell you right, I mean it's here to stay. Propping up the governments in Colombia and Peru. You ask any DEA man, they'll say there's nothing we can do.
Nowadays, what do we have? Of course, the epidemic of our time is the opioid epidemic, which some of you may remember my already commenting on last winter. Now, from what I've heard and read, this epidemic is even worse than that one. Worse than the epidemics of yesteryear, because so many more people are actually participating in it, being prescribed into it, and falling victim to it.
We live in a drug culture. People today take pills to lose weight, to gain weight, to lower cholesterol, to boost energy, to cure acne, to control blood pressure. We take medication for everything. What it adds up to is a drug culture.
So nowadays, if you were to record some news interview with an opioid dependent, that person could say, opioids, opioids, opioids. Everywhere you go, opioids. You don't hear about cocaine hardly. You don't hear about crack hardly. All you hear about is opioids.
Effective today, my administration is officially declaring the opioid crisis a national public health emergency under federal law.
So I decided I wanted to take a stab at just looking at how this epidemic can be combated. Now, it occurred to me, and I've heard it said by many others, that legalizing or at least decriminalizing marijuana, at least in its medicinal form, can contribute to the solution to this problem, or at least the successful management of it. By no means is it a panacea. There are no panaceas in the real world. No one knows that better than I do. But hopefully, medicinal marijuana in particular, and maybe marijuana in general, can help to fight this epidemic. So joining me today is someone who can help me make sense of it all. So here to discuss the issue with me today is my good friend Sam Tracy, a veteran of the drug policy reform movement. You guys might remember Sam from a video that I did almost exactly a year ago, actually, about where marijuana policy reform is likely to go under the Trump administration. Sam, thanks again for joining me yet again.
Absolutely. Good to be here.
Can you just remind, to be honest, to me and my viewers, where exactly you're working now? I know it's in Massachusetts.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm living in Boston, Massachusetts now, and I wear a few different hats. On the business side of things, I work for Forefront Ventures, which is a consulting firm that helps people open state legal marijuana businesses, so cultivation centers and dispensaries mostly. But then I do also work on the advocacy side of the issue. I am currently the Connecticut political director for the Marijuana Policy Project, so I'm running their efforts to legalize marijuana for adults in my home state of Connecticut. And I'm also a board member of Marijuana Majority, which is a nonprofit doing education about the marijuana issue.
Just out of curiosity, actually, how have those efforts been going over the past year now with Trump in office and everything that's going on?
Pretty well, actually. The Trump administration is starting to hint at some sort of movement, probably in a negative direction, but there's still not very much clarity on that. So far, they haven't done anything. They've left the Cole memo in place, so it's kind of just a wait and see right there. But all the progress really has been at the state level. And in Connecticut, we didn't pass a bill this past year, unfortunately, but we did get pretty close. We got to some committee hearings and even had it included in some budget proposals. Our budget problem isn't over, so it's definitely going to be talked about in 2018 as well. And it's a really big subject of debate for the governor's race, which is just under a year in Connecticut.
Way to go. To dive right into the topic, how exactly do you think the campaign for drug policy reform relates to the opioid crisis overall? And of what use can drug policy reform be in combating the opioid crisis?
There's so many different intersections, it's a little hard to be maybe comprehensive in all of them, but I do think that drug policy reform and everything that we've been talking about for the past decades about ending the war on drugs, shifting it from a criminal issue to a public health issue, and really using that kind of public health lens for addressing drug addiction and drug abuse is really the best way to approach the opioid overdose crisis. And I think that's something that even conservatives and people who have typically been the biggest supporters of the war on drugs are coming out in favor of saying, oh, we shouldn't be taking people who are overdosing and throwing them in jail. Maybe they want to penalize drug dealers, but as far as the users, no one's really trying to crack down on them like we did during past drug epidemics.
We're getting tough on drugs, and we mean business. For those who are thinking of using drugs, we say stop, and those who are pushing drugs, we say beware.
You sell drugs, you will be caught, and when you're caught, you will be prosecuted, and once you're convicted, you will do time.
Bush was hilarious on TV. We're going to arrest the users now. You can't get arrested for murder. More or less get arrested for dope. Where are you going to put it? Are you going to have to put half the population in jail?
I think the message of drug policy reformers has really kind of permeated the national debate and created this kind of consensus that it should be a public health issue.
The torrent of illegal drugs seems unchecked, leading to a dim but growing call for legalization, taxation, and controls.
A lot of other factors like race and things come into that as well, of course.
Jails filled up.
But I do think that it has provided a really useful lens that I think people are finally coming around to.
When it comes to the use of, for example, marijuana, particularly medicinal marijuana and analgesic to help treat pain, in particular, chronic pain, do you think that that can actually serve as a viable alternative to a lot of the opioid painkillers that are so often being overprescribed nowadays?
I do think so, and the data is starting to bear that out. But I'd hedge it all just by saying that every patient's different and different things work for different people. I think sometimes people on the pro-medical marijuana side go a little too far by saying, opiates are terrible and everyone should use medical marijuana. Some patients need opiates. Sometimes you need something much stronger that works with your body chemistry differently. But it is still true that many people do benefit from medical marijuana. And since chronic pain is the number one thing that opiates are being prescribed for, if we could give people a less addictive, zero chance of a fatal overdose drug like marijuana, rather than something that tends to be a lot more addictive and carries some really big risks as far as overdose and addiction, that would definitely be helpful for public health overall.
The thing about it is, in reading over just the past couple of years since I started hearing a lot about the opioid crisis in the news, in reading specific examples and case studies, the pattern I kept seeing emerging was you had ordinary people who weren't drug seekers at all. For whatever reason, they'd be injured, they'd get an illness, whatever the case may be, they would end up with chronic pain and they would be prescribed opioids, and that would sort of lead them down the road to dependence on opioid addiction. From there, many of them would graduate to harder drugs such as heroin, which I hear can be thousands of times more powerful than heroin itself. They say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. One useful contribution that medicinal marijuana could make is in giving these folks an alternative to opioids. For those who can benefit from medicinal marijuana, it's best to access it up front. Maybe they don't even need to get on opioids in the first place, because once they are, depending on how the treatment and the condition goes, it can be very difficult to claw your way out of that hole.
Yeah. As we've started to see, there have been, it's only a handful of studies so far, but they all point in the same direction that when there's more access to medical marijuana, there's fewer opiate prescriptions and fewer opiate deaths. The number right now is that states with medical marijuana had about 25% fewer opioid deaths per year than states without medical marijuana, which is a pretty staggering number. I think it's, 60,000 people dying every year from this. And so if you took 25% of those deaths away, that's saving 15,000 lives that we could do if we were just having the safer alternative. And there is also data about Medicaid and Medicare, the number of prescriptions for opiates going down under those programs, using that data because I think it's some of the biggest aggregate data we have out there. But people are getting prescribed it less because they are using medical marijuana as a good substitute. It's really sad just because for so long we've had this argument against medical marijuana reform, that it's a gateway drug that'll lead to people using heroin and that sort of thing. What we've all actually seen in our experience is that other opiates actually are a real gateway drug to heroin because it's an opiate too. It's the same class of drugs, and it's much more of a gateway than marijuana, but we were steering people to the thing that was more dangerous in that respect.
Now, one argument that I heard, I think from a conservative publication, about how to combat the opioid crisis, they were sort of pushing back to some degree against a lot of the more libertarian-oriented anti-drug war advocates. And they were sort of saying, you often hear that we can't arrest our way out of the opioid crisis. Then they argued that if you look at a lot of the treatment programs that have shown maybe some success in some areas with opioid dependence, often they're gotten into those programs or those other avenues of assistance because they are arrested first, but they're not necessarily incarcerated. And so courts sort of offer these treatment as an alternative to incarceration, which I think we would probably agree beats incarceration, at least.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I was wondering if you think that it's necessary to go the full legalization or decriminalization route, because I think we can agree that politically it's not realistic to think all 50 states are going to legalize drugs or even marijuana anytime soon, right? So do you think in the interim, it's a good idea to at least advocate lessening the overall dependence on incarceration as a tool for fighting drug addiction in general?
I do think that, as you said, treatment is better than incarceration, but there is also a very broad spectrum of treatment in terms of the quality and quite honestly how close to incarceration it looks. Coerced treatment where someone doesn't want to be there if there's the threat of jail hanging over them, it has actually been shown to be significantly less effective than treatment where people go voluntarily, that more people relapse if they're being forced into it. And unfortunately, because it's administered by the government, there's certain things where many public officials don't support things like methadone treatment and these kind of drug replacement therapies that are basically the consensus in the scientific community. But when you put politicians in charge of treatment programs, it gets very politicized, and they sometimes are against more effective treatments just because it has some kind of negative connotations and that sort of thing. So I think voluntary treatment is still the best. But as you said, I do think there is also a way that you can involve some degree of, for lack of a better term, force, having people who are struggling with this and aren't able to get themselves out of it to have some sort of way to get them into the system. But I think the way that Portugal handles it has actually been really successful, because what they do, it's really just decriminalized. You can't buy, heroin in a store or something like that, but personal possession is decriminalized. If you get caught with it, it does get confiscated, you get a fine. But if you're not a problematic user, if you're someone who's just casually using this drug, and it could be heroin, it could be ecstasy, it could be whatever, but if you're not showing any problems of having severe problematic drug use, they let you go. And then if you get arrested 2 or 3 times, and if you keep coming back, or if they see that your health is really bad, they put you into treatment. But it's not, coerced. It's not a law enforcement sort of way. They give you access to treatment, hook you up with social workers, that sort of thing, to actually help you and give you resources in that way. And I think that is probably a much more successful way to do it when you're working with people rather than kind of against them and forcing them into that sort of situation.
Once again, you've shown your knack for taking the words right out of my mouth. I've heard it argued recently that the opioid crisis itself is proof positive that legalizing drugs is a bad idea. Because if we legalize heroin, cocaine, whatever, methamphetamine, then before long, we're going to see a spike in the overall level of drug addiction in society at large, along the lines of what we're already seeing with opioids, which are, though regulated, are still legal. So how do you respond to that argument?
That is an unfortunate thing I've been seeing a lot of. Most notably, I think German Lopez of Vox.com had a whole article saying, I used to believe in drug legalization, then the opioid overdose crisis happened, now I don't. I empathize with that because it's an understandable part of human nature that when you're in the midst of a drug crisis or any sort of crisis, to really get more conservative and a little more fearful because bad things are happening. And that's like kind of a natural conclusion there. But at the same time, when I talk to people about drug legalization, I want to legalize drugs, but tomatoes are legal, Vicodin is legal, and alcohol is legal. They're all legal in very different ways. So it's not necessarily saying that fentanyl should be able to be sold in convenience stores. That's not what people are really advocating, because I do think there is a certain degree of regulation that is very reasonable. The same way with alcohol, we regulate the potency of it. Beer is around 5%. You can't sell something that's 99% alcohol for drinking. You have to have certain regulations and unpotency and things like that. If you were selling opiates, you wouldn't be allowing people to be purchasing fentanyl or heroin, but possibly just much lower grade opiates like they do in certain other countries. I believe there's a good Times article about in the developing world, there's certain areas where they sell essentially over the counter, very diluted morphine in a water bottle. That's such a small dose, you'd have to drink gallons in order to overdose. So it's not the same sort of problem that you could have with something much more potent. So I think there is just such a broad spectrum of regulations that work within the legalization framework, but really what they all have in common to me is just not putting people in prison for consuming a drug, especially as we're regulating and allowing some of them and not others. I just don't want the government being that hypocritical.
How much hope do you really see? I guess, let's say just in the next few years, because God knows it's so hard to predict the future, even just within the next year. How optimistic are you about the chances for continuing to rack up successes in this area?
On the opiate issue, unfortunately, it's hard to be optimistic. I don't think the Trump administration is taking it very seriously. They did create the big opioid commission, but put Chris Christie in charge of it, and he's just used it to take a bunch of cheap shots at marijuana legalization when, as we've said, that's one of the things that could be helping here. They're really doubling down on this old kind of criminal justice approach, not really giving it the public health attention that it needs. When you're putting Chris Christie, who is a governor but a prosecutor, in charge of the Opioid Commission rather than someone with a public health background, that kind of goes to show what direction you're taking things in. Fortunately, while the federal situation isn't that good, I do think we're seeing a lot of fantastic work at the local level, at the state level, with nonprofits and charities who are responding to this. So I do think it has helped humanize drug addiction, and I hope that that gets applied to users of other drugs as well, just because we've had such an empathetic response to the opioid crisis. And people have said, and I think justly so, part of that is a race issue. It's easy to demonize the crack epidemic when it was inner city Black people that were being demonized by the media. Now it's white people, and now they're getting sympathy. But I hope that that expands the sympathy to everyone, and that this can be a good first step forward in that direction.
I was going to bring that up as well. You're quite right that the cultural optics and responses to this particular epidemic are very different from what we saw just 30 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the end, all we can do is keep fighting, and I once again salute you for all the good work that you and your fellow anti-drug warriors are doing in this area. I wish you all the best of luck, and I look forward to following up with you in the months to come to hear about more, hopefully, progress.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks a lot again for sharing your wisdom.
All right. Likewise.